We will now begin questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Engler, in your testimony today, you talked about the new chemicals program, and you imply that EPA misinterpreted the TSCA risk-based standard. For my constituents watching at home, could you explain how exactly chemical exposure is defined, how it relates to risk, and how you feel the EPA misinterpreted TSCA?
So when EPA reviews a new chemical, they look at all the hazards. They look at information provided by the submitter. If the submitter provides or has information about releases and exposures, they'll review that. If that information is not provided, EPA will predict releases and exposures using its own models and worst-case assumptions. And so this has been routine, and this has been done for as long as I've been working on TSCA, which is 27 years now. What happens now is, regardless of the outcome of EPA's models, even if EPA does not find risk using its worst-case assumptions, if there is a hazard above EPA's low hazard threshold, EPA issues a restriction of one form or another. So the risk is gone from the equation. If there's a hazard, EPA views that there must be a restriction. Any uncertainty leads to a restriction.
And so you're not talking about unreasonable risk, you're just talking about
any possible risk.
Any
right?
possible risk.
Yeah, EPA uses thresholds. They compare numerically, they compare exposures to the hazard thresholds. So they look and compare, this is the concern level, where is the exposure level? If the exposure level is below the concern level, there's no unreasonable risk. Even when EPA finds that the exposure is below the concern, they still issue a restriction.
So thus your shark analogy, which I loved, and your vinegar analogy, and I think in your written testimony you mentioned lemon juice might not make the cut.
Lemon juice would also probably be banned from consumer use, yes.
I got to ask because I eat too much of it, I'm sure, but how about my sodium chloride that I love?
I'll leave that to you and your doctor.
All right. So you don't think TSCA would get involved in that if it were a new chemical suddenly?
Sodium chloride might pass.
It might pass. All right, well, that's good to know. Dr. Engler, do you believe EPA's new chemicals division follows basic evidentiary procedure in its decision-making process, yes or no?
Generally, we've had mixed results, and it depends a lot on who's reviewing a case, which is one of the problems we have. A review of a particular case should not depend on the reviewer. The system should be predictable and consistent.
Yeah.
In some cases, we provide data, we provide measured data, and EPA will use that data and assess the risk, and they will still issue a restriction if it's above the low hazard threshold. In other cases, we provide data and the assessors ignore the data or they dismiss the data. They don't necessarily explain why, and they just use whatever conservative assumption, and again, we end up with a restriction.
As Chairman Guthrie alluded to in his opening remarks, we have just received an additional report from the GAO this morning. While we haven't had time to fully review all of its implications, the GAO does make it clear that the new chemicals division does not follow most key practices for managing and assessing the results of its new chemicals program and does not make use of evidence to learn or uses practices that would allow, apply learning to decision-making, end quote, at the division. I'm sure that has to do with different people making different decisions. Based on reading the testimony, I'm not surprised by this, and I look forward to working with all of our witnesses to improve the new chemicals program, but it just goes to show that we probably ought to open it up, as Congress often ought to do with a lot of different bills, every now and then, and say, is it working? Check the engine, so to speak. Yeah. Mr. John, could you expound some on what, in your opinion, should be considered the best available science for evaluating new chemicals?
So as you just said, the GAO report, I found out about that on the way over. I'm not surprised our members were interviewed in that process, and they provide science, for example, for the EPA to use that they request. However, very often what EPA ends up doing is doing its own modeling and using that data rather than the real-world data that our members provide to EPA for the assessment. That's one of the reasons that the new chemicals program takes so long.
All right, I appreciate that. Dr. Engler, again, could you explain just briefly the advantages and disadvantages of statistical modeling for chemical releases?
Well, statistical modeling can be used to see what a worst case is. So EPA frequently uses 95th percentile. They don't look at the absolute worst case, they look at sort of a reasonable worst case. And so you're not looking at the very end when you talk about a statistical analysis, They don't look all the way at the very end of the tail. They look for that 95th percentile as a worst case.
All right. I appreciate that. My time is up, so I now yield back.